Trapped Apache woman, she expected death, yet the cowboy made her his wife. From the very first moments of her life, she learned that living in this land meant understanding its beauty and its dangers. The desert was not kind to those who were careless, and Maria's family, like many others in her Apache tribe, had to know every secret of the land to survive. She learned to walk quietly, to notice the smallest footprints of animals, and to recognize the signs of rain before the clouds even appeared. Her mother, a woman of great strength and calm, taught her everything about the ways of their people. She showed Maria how to gather herbs for medicine, how to start a fire even when the wind tried to blow it out, and how to listen to the stories carried by the wind. Her father, a skilled hunter, taught her how to move silently through the canyons and how to understand the tracks of animals. He also taught her the lessons of courage, patience, and respect for nature. Maria grew up knowing that every moment in this land could be a test. But life was not only about survival. Maria's tribe celebrated the turning of seasons with dances, songs, and stories passed down from one generation to the next. She would sit by the fire at night, listening to elders speak of heroes, spirits, and the ways of the earth. She loved those nights, when the flames danced like small stars, and the air was filled with the sound of drums and laughter. Even as she learned the skills needed to live in the harsh desert, Maria's heart was full of dreams. She wanted to see the mountains beyond the canyon, to know the rivers where the fish ran thick, and to feel the wind across her face in places she had never been. However, the beauty of her world was shadowed by danger. Around her, the land was changing. Settlers were moving closer, bringing with them new ways, new laws, and new conflicts. Sometimes, Maria would see strangers on horseback far across the desert, their faces hidden beneath wide hats, their intentions unknown. Rumors traveled faster than the wind. Settlers were claiming land, building fences, and taking what they wanted without understanding the lives of the people who had been there for generations. Her parents warned her to be careful, to never trust strangers too quickly, and to always remember that their survival depended on caution and knowledge. Despite the looming danger, Maria lived freely. She loved running through the canyons, her bare feet barely touching the rocky ground, feeling the sun warm her skin and the wind lifting her hair. She would climb the hills and sit for hours watching the horizon, imagining the life she could have beyond the desert, a life full of adventure and hope. She had a sense that she was strong and capable, even though the world outside her tribe was unknown and sometimes frightening. She knew that one day, she might have to face challenges that could test every skill she had learned, every lesson her parents had taught her. One day, as she was collecting herbs near the edge of the canyon, Maria felt a strange unease. The air was heavier than usual, and the birds had stopped singing. She knew the desert had its own language, and the silence of the land often meant something important was about to happen. She looked toward the distant hills and noticed movement. A small group of men, riding quickly on horseback, were coming down the trail. Maria froze, her heart beating fast. She could see that they were strangers, armed and unfamiliar, and a chill ran through her. She had been taught to run in such moments, to hide, to use the land to her advantage, but something about these men made her pause. Her instincts screamed that danger was near. She remembered her father's words, "Always respect the land, and the land will protect you." But never forget that people can be more dangerous than storms. Maria crouched behind a rock, holding her breath, watching the strangers approach. She tried to blend into the shadows, using every trick she had learned as a child. Yet no matter how skilled she was, she could not shake the fear growing in her chest. Something about these men felt different. They were fast, organized, and their eyes seemed to search the land for something or someone. As the men came closer, Maria realized she could not outrun them. There were too many, and the desert offered too few hiding places near the trail. She considered running deeper into the canyon, but the terrain was rough and unfamiliar, and she could easily lose herself. Her mind raced. She thought of her family, of the home she loved, of the life she had known. The thought of never seeing them again made her chest tighten. She also thought of the stories her mother had told her about courage, not the absence of fear, but the ability to face fear with determination. Maria took a deep breath, feeling the wind on her face, and made a silent decision to prepare herself for whatever was coming. The men reached the edge of the canyon and stopped. One of them, taller and broader than the others, seemed to lead them. Maria noticed something in his eyes, a mixture of curiosity and caution. He was not immediately threatening, but he carried the authority of someone used to controlling situations. Maria could feel her heart pounding, yet she reminded herself to stay calm, to observe, to think. She was small, alone and unarmed, but she had the strength of the land and the lessons of her people guiding her. She remembered another lesson her father had taught her. Fear is a shadow. It exists to teach you who you are, not to stop you. Face it and you will see the truth. Maria focused on the shadow of the men, their movements, their intentions, and tried to predict what they might do next. Her mind became sharp, alert. Every detail mattered. The direction of their horses' ears, the tone of their voices, the way they held their hands near their weapons. She realized she was not powerless. She had the land as her ally, her knowledge as her shield, and her courage as her sword. Despite the danger, Maria's spirit remained unbroken. She had grown up in a world where life was often uncertain, where the desert could take everything in an instant. Yet she had also learned that survival depended not just on strength, but on wit, patience, and understanding. She had a feeling deep in her heart that the coming days would test her like never before, but she was determined to meet them with the dignity and courage that her family had instilled in her. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the canyon, Maria prepared herself. She knew the world beyond her tribe was changing, and she would soon face it head-on. Whether it brought danger or opportunity, fear or trust, she was ready to meet it. Little did she know that this encounter would change her life forever, bringing her into the world of strangers, into situations she had only imagined, and into the presence of a man who would become both a challenge and a turning point in her story. Maria crouched among the rocks, feeling the heat of the day fade into the cool evening air. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the lessons of her parents, the whispers of the desert, and the rhythm of her own heartbeat prepare her. She did not yet know what fate had in store, but she knew one thing clearly. She would face it as she had faced every challenge in her life, strong, alert, and unafraid to fight for her life if necessary. And so, as the shadows of the men grew longer and the canyon seemed to hold its breath, Maria waited. She was ready to survive, ready to adapt, and ready to discover that life could sometimes bring unexpected twists, moments where fear, courage, and hope intertwined in ways she could never have imagined. Maria had barely recovered from the fear of the approaching strangers when the men came closer. Her heart raced as she crouched behind the rocks, hoping they would not notice her. Every sound of hooves on the rocky trail made her flinch. Her mind worked quickly, thinking of the lessons her parents had taught her. Observe first, act carefully, and never underestimate the power of the land. She knew she had to make a decision, but the canyon offered few options for escape. The men were moving with purpose, their eyes scanning the edges of the rocks as if they were searching for something or someone. The tall man, the leader, paused and looked around. Maria could see him clearly now, broad shoulders, weathered face, and eyes that seemed both sharp and calculating. He was not shouting or careless. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone used to controlling situations. Maria realized that if she were discovered, she would have no chance to outrun him. She hugged the shadows of the canyon walls, her mind racing. She had faced many dangers in the desert, wild animals, harsh weather, and even small skirmishes, but this was different. Humans were unpredictable, and these strangers could bring her death or capture. Suddenly, one of the men noticed something near the rocks. Maria froze. Her heart felt like it would burst. She tried to steady her breathing, remembering her father's words. When fear takes hold, let your mind become the strongest weapon you have. Slowly, carefully, she made herself appear calm, showing no sudden movements. The man stepped closer to the rock where she hid, scanning the shadows with a keen eye. Maria knew she had to think quickly. The desert had always been her ally, and now it was time to use its lessons. She remembered a narrow crevice a few feet away, hidden from immediate view. If she could reach it quietly, she might slip past them without being noticed. But just as she prepared to move, the leader's voice cut through the silence. "Stop right there." Maria's blood ran cold. She had been seen. Her heart hammered as she weighed her options. She could run blindly into the canyon, hoping her speed and knowledge of the rocks would save her, or she could surrender and hope that the men were not cruel. Her instincts screamed at her to escape, but something about the man's tone made her hesitate. It was not angry or threatening. There was a strange calmness to it, almost as if he were curious rather than cruel. Before she could decide, the leader dismounted his horse. He moved carefully toward her, stopping a few feet away. Maria held her ground, her body tense, ready to react. The man's eyes met hers, and for a moment the desert felt still. He spoke again, this time in a soft, steady voice. "You're not like the others," he said. Maria did not understand what he meant, but she kept her eyes on him, wary. She had been taught never to trust strangers, yet something about his presence was different. He did not move like someone intending immediate harm. Instead, he studied her, as if trying to understand who she was and why she was there. Maria realized that this moment could determine her life. One wrong move, one sudden gesture, and everything could be lost. She took a slow, deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She reminded herself of all she had learned in the desert: patience, observation, and courage. These were not just lessons for survival. They were the tools that would help her face what was coming next. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her, yet she also felt a strange determination rising inside her. She would not let fear control her. The man reached out a hand, not to grab or harm her, but as if offering something. Maria did not move. She had learned to read intentions through body language and instinct, but this gesture was unlike anything she had ever seen. There was no threat, no cruelty, only a silent challenge and a hint of respect. She felt a flicker of something unexpected: curiosity. Perhaps, she thought, he is testing me, trying to see how I will respond. Perhaps he wants to know who I really am. Her decision came quickly. Instead of running or panicking, she slowly stepped forward, keeping her hands visible. She showed him that she was not a threat, yet she did not submit either. The man's eyes softened slightly, and for the first time, Maria felt that he recognized her strength. She realized that in this moment, her courage and intelligence were her only allies. She could not control what would happen next, but she could control how she faced it. Over the next few hours, the men escorted her to a small, isolated cabin at the edge of the canyon. Maria walked carefully, keeping her eyes on every movement and listening to every sound. The desert was quiet around them, but it felt alive with hidden dangers. She noticed the tracks of coyotes in the sand, the distant shadow of a hawk circling above, and the way the wind carried the scent of sage and dry earth. Each detail was important, a reminder that she had survived many challenges before and could do so again. When they arrived at the cabin, Maria's fear deepened. The place was remote, far from any town or settlement. She understood immediately that escape would be difficult. The man who led her entered first, setting down his gear carefully. Maria followed, keeping her distance but observing everything. The cabin was simple but sturdy, made of wood and stone, with a small fire pit in the center. It was clear that the man had lived here alone for some time. Maria noticed the careful organization of his tools, the neatness of his belongings, and the way he treated the space with respect. This was not a place of cruelty, it was a place of survival. The man spoke again, his voice calm and deliberate. "You are safe here for now." Maria did not respond. She could not fully trust him yet, but she understood the meaning of his words. She was not in immediate danger, but her freedom was limited. She realized that she would need to rely on her intelligence and courage more than ever before. She took a seat on a small wooden stool, keeping her eyes on the door and the man who had brought her here. She knew that the coming days would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. As the sun set and the desert turned orange and pink, Maria watched the shadows stretch across the cabin floor. She thought about her family and the life she had known. Tears came to her eyes, but she refused to give them to fear alone. She thought about her mother's teachings, her father's lessons, and the strength that had been passed down to her. She understood that survival was not just about escaping danger. It was about understanding it, facing it, and learning from it. The man, whose name she later learned was Caleb, began to speak carefully, asking her questions about herself, her family, and her knowledge of the land. Maria answered slowly, cautiously. She did not reveal too much, but she offered enough to show that she was not afraid and that she respected him as someone who had power in this situation. Caleb listened intently, nodding at times but never interrupting. Maria noticed that he did not raise his voice, nor did he show anger. There was a strange balance in his manner, strength paired with restraint. It was both reassuring and unsettling. Days passed, and Maria settled into a tense routine. She explored the cabin and the surrounding land, careful not to venture too far. Caleb brought her food and water, never threatening her, but never allowing her to leave either. Maria realized that she had to remain alert at all times. The desert was not only a place of beauty and survival, but also a test of patience, endurance, and courage. She practiced her skills quietly, observing the land, the weather, and the movements of animals. She sharpened her senses, knowing that every detail could make a difference in her safety. During this time, Maria began to notice small acts of kindness from Caleb. He would place food near the cabin door when he left, or leave water in the sun to warm before bringing it to her. These small gestures were careful and deliberate, and Maria could sense that they were not meant to intimidate, but to test her reactions. She began to realize that Caleb was not the cruel man she had feared. He was a man of complexity, capable of strength, but also of respect and restraint. This realization confused her, but it also sparked a cautious curiosity. As the nights grew longer and the desert winds blew colder, Maria thought about the future. She did not know what Caleb's intentions were, nor could she predict what challenges lay ahead. But she knew one thing: she was alive, and she had survived another trial. Each day brought a mix of fear, observation, and quiet learning. She began to see that this unexpected captivity was also a test of her courage, her intelligence, and her ability to understand human behavior. Maria sat by the fire each night, listening to the crackle of the flames and the distant calls of desert creatures. She reflected on her life, her tribe, and the lessons that had shaped her. She realized that her survival depended not just on her physical skills, but on her ability to remain calm, alert, and thoughtful. She understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. And she knew that the coming days with Caleb would continue to test every part of her being. Days passed in the small cabin, and Maria began to feel the weight of her situation more heavily. The initial fear of being taken had shifted into a deeper, more unsettling uncertainty. She understood that Caleb, the man who had brought her here, had not harmed her, but she could not yet trust him. Each movement he made, each look he gave, reminded her that her freedom was limited and that death or danger could still be near. She had survived storms, wild animals, and the harsh desert, but this, being trapped by another human, felt far more complicated and frightening. Maria spent much of her time observing Caleb. He worked quietly around the cabin, repairing tools, checking traps, and caring for the small garden he had planted near the back. He moved with careful precision, his hands steady, his eyes always alert. Maria realized that Caleb was not a reckless man. He had skills, patience, and intelligence, qualities that could make him a deadly enemy, but also perhaps a protector if approached carefully. She noticed small details: the way he arranged the firewood, the way he kept the cabin clean, the way he respected the animals and the land around him. It became clear to her that he was a man of discipline, someone who valued order and understanding. Despite this observation, Maria could not ignore the fear that lingered in her chest. Nights were the hardest. When the desert winds howled outside, the isolation of the cabin felt suffocating. Shadows danced across the walls, and every creak of the floorboards made her heart leap. She often sat quietly, hugging her knees, thinking about her family, her tribe, and the life she had known. Tears would sometimes come, and she would silently mourn the freedom she had lost. Yet even in these moments, she reminded herself of the lessons her parents had taught her. Courage, patience, and intelligence could carry her through the darkest moments. As the days turned into weeks, Maria began to notice subtle changes in Caleb's behavior toward her. He no longer simply brought her food and water. He began speaking to her, asking simple questions about her life, her family, and the ways of her tribe. At first, Maria was cautious. She answered only what was necessary, careful not to reveal too much. She had been raised to protect her knowledge and her family, to understand that words could be as dangerous as any weapon. But she also realized that Caleb was listening, genuinely listening, not just to control her, but to understand her. Maria began to see that her captivity was not as simple as she had first feared. Caleb did not treat her cruelly, nor did he push her beyond the limits she could bear. Instead, he observed her, challenged her, and seemed to respect her spirit. Maria found herself thinking about him in ways that confused her. He was the man who had taken her from freedom, yet he was also the one who had kept her alive, who seemed to value her strength and courage. She could not yet understand him, but she knew that her survival depended on her ability to read him carefully. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Maria sat by the fire, lost in thought. Caleb approached, carrying a small bundle of herbs and food. He set it down gently near her and spoke softly. "You must eat," he said. "You cannot face the desert or the land without strength." Maria looked at him, her heart torn between caution and gratitude. She knew he had power over her, but she also understood that he was offering care, not cruelty. She took the food slowly, nodding in acknowledgement, but did not speak. Words were dangerous, she reminded herself, and actions often spoke louder than them. As the nights continued, Maria's mind began to wander to the past. She remembered her childhood in the desert, the nights by the fire with her family, the songs, the stories, and the lessons. She thought about her mother's calm voice, explaining the ways of plants and medicine, and her father's steady hands, showing her how to track animals and read the land. All these lessons now seemed more important than ever. They were not just survival skills, they were her lifeline in a world that suddenly felt uncertain and threatening. One night, Maria awoke to the sound of a branch scraping against the cabin window. She froze, her body tense, listening carefully. Caleb was nearby, but she could not see him in the dark. The wind outside was strong, and the desert felt alive with movement. Her heart raced as she tried to decide whether the noise was a threat or just a natural sound. She remembered the teachings of her tribe: the desert speaks if you listen. She held her breath, paying attention to every small noise, every change in the air. Slowly, she realized that it was just a falling branch, moved by the wind. Her body relaxed, but the adrenaline lingered. She understood that fear was constant, but courage and alertness were her tools for survival. Over the following days, Maria began to explore the cabin more carefully. She tested the limits of her space, learning every corner, every possible escape route, and every point of observation. She observed Caleb as he worked, noting his habits, his routines, and his personality. She began to realize that he respected boundaries, that he was not cruel, and that he valued strength in others. This understanding did not erase her fear, but it allowed her to see that not all captors were the same, and that human behavior was complex and unpredictable. Maria also began to think more deeply about her own feelings. She had never trusted a stranger so completely in her life, and yet she found herself observing Caleb with a mixture of caution and curiosity. She noticed how he moved, how he spoke, how he treated the land and the animals around him. There was a sense of order and respect in him that intrigued her. She realized that her initial judgment of him as a threat might not tell the whole story. He was a man shaped by the land, by survival, and perhaps by a sense of honor she had yet to fully understand. The crisis of her situation grew not from immediate physical danger, but from the uncertainty and the mental strain of being trapped. Maria felt the weight of every decision she made. One wrong word, one wrong move, and she could lose any sense of control. She had to remain constantly vigilant, mentally strong, and emotionally resilient. The challenge was not just surviving the desert or Caleb's presence. It was surviving the unknown, the unpredictability of human intention, and her own fears. Maria's inner strength began to grow during this time. She realized that fear could be a tool if understood correctly. It reminded her of the stakes, of the dangers, and of the need to remain alert. But it could not control her. She decided that she would meet each day with courage, careful observation, and a clear mind. She would not allow her fear to weaken her. Instead, she would use it to sharpen her senses, to deepen her understanding, and to prepare herself for whatever was coming next. One evening, as she sat by the fire, Caleb spoke in a quiet voice. "You are strong. You are not afraid to face challenges. That is why you survive." Maria looked at him, surprised by his words. She did not fully trust him, but she felt a small spark of recognition. He had noticed her courage. In a world where she had expected only fear and danger, this acknowledgement felt strange and even comforting. Maria realized that Caleb's respect for her strength might be the key to surviving this uncertain time. As the days continued, Maria and Caleb developed a cautious understanding. She observed him, listened to him, and began to recognize patterns in his behavior. He was a man of complexity, capable of both strength and restraint, and she learned to adapt to his presence without losing herself. She began to feel a small sense of agency, understanding that even in captivity, she could assert her mind, her courage, and her values. This realization gave her hope, even in the darkest moments. Maria also began to think about what life could be beyond the cabin. She did not know what Caleb wanted, nor what the future held, but she realized that she had survived far worse than fear itself. She had survived the harsh desert, the loss of certainty, and the shadow of potential death. Now, she was learning to survive the most complex challenge of all, navigating the unpredictable nature of human relationships, power, and respect. Each day brought new lessons. She observed Caleb's routines, the way he tended to the land, and the quiet discipline that governed his life. She learned to interpret his gestures, his expressions, and his intentions. She began to see him not only as her captor, but as a man shaped by experience, survival, and honor. This understanding did not erase fear, but it allowed Maria to approach each day with intelligence and strategy. She realized that survival was not only about fleeing or fighting, it was about understanding, patience, and cautious connection. Maria's crisis reached its peak not in a single moment of danger, but in the slow, relentless pressure of uncertainty. Each day, each interaction, tested her strength, her patience, and her courage. She realized that her survival depended not only on her skills and intelligence, but also on her ability to navigate human behavior, to read intentions, and to maintain her own values and dignity in a difficult and unfamiliar situation. By the end of this period, Maria had learned an important truth. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to face it with awareness, patience, and strategy. She understood that her situation was dangerous and uncertain, but she also recognized that she had survived because of her strength, her knowledge, and her careful observation. This realization gave her a quiet confidence, even as the challenges of captivity continued. Days had passed in the small cabin, and Maria began to understand something important. Survival alone was no longer enough. She could withstand hunger, fear, and isolation, but the real challenge was understanding Caleb, understanding him well enough to protect herself and perhaps to find a way to live within this situation. At first, she had thought of escape constantly, imagining ways to run and return to her family. Yet, with every passing day, she realized that the world outside the cabin was dangerous, and running blindly could bring certain death. The desert was vast, but it had no mercy for the lost or unprepared. Maria began to pay closer attention to Caleb's routines. She noticed the small ways he moved through the cabin and the land. He woke early, worked steadily, and never wasted energy. He tended to the small garden, repaired tools with care, and observed the land with a watchful eye. Maria began to see that his life was disciplined, ordered, and careful. Unlike the strangers who sometimes terrorized travelers or settlers, Caleb seemed to value thoughtfulness and caution. Slowly, she realized that she could use this knowledge to her advantage. By understanding him, she could maintain her safety while asserting her own presence in the cabin. At first, Maria tested him cautiously. She would ask questions about his life, speak about small details of the desert, or demonstrate her own knowledge of the land. Caleb responded in ways that showed interest but never condescension. He seemed to recognize her intelligence, her strength, and her courage. Maria began to see that her mind was her strongest tool, not brute force, not speed, but careful observation, thought, and the ability to act at the right time. She realized that surviving this situation meant adapting, learning, and sometimes even cooperating with the very man who had brought her here. The turning point came one afternoon when a sudden storm rolled in from the mountains. Dark clouds covered the sky, and the wind howled through the canyon, carrying sand and debris. Maria watched the approaching storm from the cabin window, recognizing the signs her parents had taught her: the air pressure dropping, the distant rumble of thunder, and the smell of rain in the dry desert air. She realized that the storm could be dangerous, especially in the open canyon, where sudden floods or falling debris could cause serious harm. Caleb, noticing her concern, approached. He spoke in a calm, steady voice. "The storm is coming fast. We need to secure the cabin and the animals. Help me." Maria looked at him cautiously. This was not a request, it was a test, a moment where her actions could reveal her courage, her intelligence, and her trustworthiness. She could have stayed silent, refused, or run to hide, but she understood that her choice now could change the dynamic between them. She nodded and followed his instructions. Together, they worked quickly to tie down loose objects, secure the small garden, and move the animals into the safety of the cabin. As they worked side by side, Maria realized something remarkable. She was no longer simply a captive. She was an active participant, demonstrating her skills and courage. Caleb watched her carefully, sometimes nodding in silent approval, other times observing with quiet calculation. Maria noticed that her actions mattered, that her strength, intelligence, and courage were being recognized. This was the first time she felt that she was not just surviving, but shaping her own situation. When the storm finally passed, leaving the canyon drenched in quiet, Maria and Caleb sat near the fire. They were both wet and tired, but there was a new understanding between them. Neither spoke immediately. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was a shared acknowledgement of the storm they had faced together, a recognition of each other's abilities. Maria realized that trust was being built, not through words, but through shared experience and demonstrated skill. She understood that Caleb had begun to respect her, not as someone weak or helpless, but as someone capable and intelligent. From that moment, Maria made a conscious decision. She would not simply wait for events to unfold, she would act with purpose. She began to communicate more with Caleb, carefully revealing her knowledge of the desert, the plants, and survival techniques. She offered advice on how to improve the cabin, how to store water more efficiently, and how to track animals for food. Each suggestion was measured and deliberate, showing that she was not a threat to him but an ally in survival. Caleb listened, sometimes nodding in agreement, sometimes asking questions. Maria noticed that he respected her input and that their relationship was slowly changing from captor and captive to a cautious partnership. Despite this growing connection, Maria never forgot the precariousness of her situation. She remained vigilant, observing Caleb's moods, his actions, and his intentions. She knew that trust had to be earned and maintained, and she was careful not to reveal too much too soon. Yet at the same time, she realized that cooperation and understanding could increase her safety and even her influence within the cabin. She began to see that survival was not just about strength and intelligence. It was also about strategy, patience, and the careful management of relationships. One evening, as the fire crackled and the desert night settled around them, Caleb spoke quietly. "You are brave, Maria. You face fear without letting it control you. That is why you survive here." Maria looked at him, surprised by the directness of his words. She realized that he had noticed her courage, her intelligence, and her composure. For the first time, she felt a spark of pride, not arrogance, but the quiet acknowledgement that she had survived against incredible odds. She understood that her actions had earned a measure of respect, and that this respect could be the foundation for navigating the uncertain days ahead. Maria began to explore ways to influence her circumstances without challenging Caleb's authority directly. She observed his habits, his likes, and his dislikes. She learned when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to act decisively. She discovered that even small actions, helping with chores, offering food to the animals, or suggesting improvements in the cabin, could shift the dynamic between them. Slowly, she began to assert herself in subtle ways, maintaining her dignity while demonstrating her value. The real test came when a small accident occurred in the cabin. A lantern tipped over, causing a small fire to flare in the corner. Maria acted instantly. She grabbed a blanket, smothered the flames, and ensured that the fire did not spread. Caleb arrived moments later, astonished at her quick response. He looked at her with a new understanding, his eyes reflecting respect and admiration. Maria realized that her courage and decisive action had shifted their relationship once again. She was no longer simply a passive captive. She was an active participant in their shared survival. In the days following the accident, Maria and Caleb began to communicate more openly. They shared stories of their lives, their families, and their experiences in the desert. Maria learned that Caleb had lived in the region for many years, surviving alone through hardship, skill, and determination. Caleb learned about Maria's family, her tribe, and the lessons she had learned from her parents. Slowly, a cautious understanding developed between them, a recognition of each other's strengths, a respect for courage and intelligence, and a growing sense of trust. Maria realized that her situation had changed. What had begun as fear, uncertainty, and captivity was evolving into a more complex relationship. She was still cautious, still aware that danger and unpredictability could return at any moment, But she also recognized that trust and cooperation could increase her safety and influence. She understood that survival in this situation required not just physical strength, but emotional intelligence, strategic thinking, and the ability to read and respond to human behavior. By the end of this period, Maria had made a critical decision. She would meet the challenges ahead with courage, intelligence, and strategy. She would no longer wait passively for events to unfold. She would act deliberately, using her knowledge and skills to navigate the uncertainty. She would cooperate where it was beneficial, assert herself where it was necessary, and maintain her dignity and strength at all times. This decision marked a turning point in her life. Maria was no longer simply a woman trapped by circumstance. She was a woman shaping her own fate, navigating the complexities of human behavior, and demonstrating that courage, intelligence, and strategic thinking could overcome fear and uncertainty. She realized that the cabin, the desert, and even Caleb himself were not just challenges. They were opportunities to assert her strength, to survive, and to grow. As the sun set over the canyon and the desert wind carried the scent of sage and earth, Maria sat by the fire, reflecting on the journey so far. She understood that the coming days would continue to test her, that challenges were not yet over, and that she would need all her skills, patience, and courage to face them. Yet, for the first time since her capture, she felt a sense of agency and purpose. She was no longer a passive observer of her fate. She was an active participant, shaping her own path in the desert and ready to face whatever the future held. Days had turned into weeks, and Maria felt the slow but undeniable shift in her life. What had started as fear, uncertainty, and captivity had begun to transform into a cautious understanding between her and Caleb. She had learned to navigate his moods, anticipate his actions, and even influence the small routines of the cabin. At the same time, she had grown to see Caleb not only as a man of strength, but as someone capable of respect, patience, and subtle kindness. The fear that had once dominated her thoughts was now tempered by a sense of awareness and cautious trust. Maria noticed that Caleb began to include her in the rhythms of his daily life. When he tended to the animals, he would ask her for advice, observing how she interpreted their behavior. When he prepared meals or repaired tools, he sometimes sought her opinion or assistance. Maria realized that her knowledge of the desert, the land, and survival had become valuable to him. This gave her a quiet sense of empowerment. She was no longer simply reacting to events, she was shaping them. Her courage, intelligence, and understanding of human behavior allowed her to take an active role in her own survival and in the life of the cabin. The transition was not instant, nor was it easy. Maria still remembered the moments of fear, the uncertainty of the early days, and the nights when the desert seemed unbearably lonely and dangerous. She remembered the sharp fear in her chest when she first saw Caleb approaching in the canyon, the fear that had once made her heart pound so fast it felt as though it might stop. But she also remembered the small acts that had slowly changed her perception of him. The gentle way he placed food near the cabin, the careful respect he showed for her space, and the way he acknowledged her strength without trying to dominate it. One morning, Maria woke to the sound of birds singing and the soft glow of sunlight on the canyon walls. The desert had changed subtly overnight, the harshness softened by the cool light of dawn. She took a moment to breathe in the air, noticing the smell of sage and dry earth. Then she saw Caleb approaching from the garden, carrying a small bundle of wildflowers he had gathered from the canyon slopes. He smiled, a small, quiet smile that was not often seen, and handed her the flowers. Maria felt a warmth she had not expected. It was a gesture of kindness, simple and sincere, and it reminded her that human connections could exist even in the most unexpected circumstances. That day, Maria and Caleb spent hours working together. She helped him with the garden, showing him where certain herbs grew best and how to protect young plants from the harsh sun. They repaired fences and repaired tools side by side. Each task was simple, yet it was also a form of communication. Actions had begun to speak louder than words. Maria realized that this shared work created trust and understanding between them, and she felt a growing sense of connection that went beyond mere survival. Evenings were spent around the fire, where conversation flowed more freely than before. Caleb shared stories of his life in the desert, the struggles, the challenges, and the moments of quiet beauty he had witnessed alone. Maria shared her own stories of the tribe, of her parents' teachings, and of the lessons she had learned from the land. These exchanges allowed them to see each other as more than just captor and captive. They began to recognize shared values: respect for nature, courage in the face of danger, and the importance of knowledge and skill. The foundation of understanding and respect was slowly being built. Over time, Maria noticed subtle changes in Caleb's behavior. He no longer spoke in commanding tones or moved with only authority in mind. Instead, he listened more, asked questions, and sometimes sought her opinion before acting. Maria recognized that her presence had influenced him as much as he had influenced her. She was no longer simply surviving. She was shaping the relationship, guiding it with careful observation, intelligence, and courage. Each day brought a new understanding of the man who had once seemed like her greatest threat. One afternoon, as the sun set and painted the canyon in shades of gold and crimson, Caleb approached Maria with a gentle seriousness. "I have come to respect you, Maria," he said, "not just for your strength but for your courage and intelligence. I have watched how you face every challenge without fear, and I cannot help but admire you." Maria looked at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief, caution, and curiosity. She had never expected such words, and yet they reflected everything she had quietly observed about him. This acknowledgement was more powerful than any promise or action. It was recognition, respect, and a quiet invitation to trust. That night, Maria reflected on everything that had happened since her capture. She thought of the fear she had felt in the canyon, the uncertainty in the cabin, and the countless small moments that had tested her courage and intelligence. She realized that she had not only survived but had grown stronger and wiser. Her understanding of Caleb, of herself, and of the unpredictable nature of human relationships had deepened. She understood that life could offer unexpected paths, and that courage and patience could turn even the darkest circumstances into opportunities for connection and growth. As the weeks turned into months, Maria and Caleb's relationship continued to evolve. They shared responsibilities, solved problems together, and learned to anticipate each other's needs. Trust had grown, not through forced submission, but through shared experience, respect, and demonstrated courage. Maria had learned to rely on her intelligence and intuition, and Caleb had come to value her insights and her resilience. What had begun as fear and captivity was slowly becoming something entirely different: mutual respect, understanding, and a bond forged in the desert. Eventually, Caleb spoke in a quiet moment, a question that Maria had not expected. "Maria, would you consider living here with me as a partner?" Maria felt her heart skip a beat. The words were simple, yet they carried immense weight. She had entered this situation expecting only fear, perhaps even death. Yet now, she was being offered a choice, a recognition of her courage and value, and an invitation to shape her own future alongside the man who had once captured her. She took a deep breath, remembering everything she had endured, every lesson she had learned, and every act of courage that had brought her to this moment. Maria's decision was deliberate, thoughtful, and guided by her understanding of both the man before her and herself. She agreed, not because she had no other choice, but because she recognized that this path offered safety, respect, and the possibility of a life where courage and intelligence were honored. By choosing to remain with Caleb, she was asserting her agency, her values, and her strength. This was not submission, it was a conscious, empowered choice. The days that followed were filled with new challenges and joys. Maria and Caleb worked together to improve the cabin, tend to the land, and ensure their survival. They shared meals, stories, and quiet moments of connection. Each day reinforced the trust, respect, and understanding that had grown between them. Maria knew that life in the desert would never be easy, but she also knew that together they could face challenges, protect each other, and build a life founded on courage, intelligence, and mutual respect. Over time, their story became known among both settlers and the Apache. People spoke quietly of the woman who had been taken, and yet had survived through courage and intelligence, forming a bond with the man who had once seemed her captor. Maria's story was not one of fear or submission, but of strength, adaptability, and the remarkable ability of humans to find connection and understanding in the most unexpected circumstances. As the sun rose over the canyon, Maria stood at the edge of the cliffs, looking out at the vast desert. She thought of her family, her tribe, and the life she had once known. She realized that she had faced her deepest fears, learned to navigate uncertainty, and found a path forward that honored her strength and intelligence. She felt a sense of peace, knowing that she had survived, grown, and created a life of meaning and connection. Caleb joined her silently, his presence steady and reassuring. They stood together, looking at the horizon, knowing that the desert was still full of challenges, but also full of possibility. Maria felt gratitude, not only for her survival, but for the lessons she had learned, the courage she had discovered within herself, and the bond she had formed with a man who had once seemed her greatest threat. In that quiet moment, she understood that life could offer the unexpected, that courage could transform fear, and that true connection could grow even from the most unlikely beginnings. Maria's journey had begun in fear, uncertainty, and captivity. It had tested every part of her, her body, her mind, and her spirit. Yet through courage, intelligence, patience, and careful understanding of human nature, she had turned a moment of danger into a life of respect, partnership, and hope. Her story became a quiet legend, a testament to the power of strength, strategy, and the human capacity to transform fear into understanding and captivity into connection. In the end, Maria stood tall in the desert she had always loved, not as a woman trapped, but as a woman who had claimed her life, her choices, and her future. Caleb stood beside her, not as a captor but as a partner, united by respect, courage, and a bond forged through the most challenging of circumstances. Together they faced the vast desert, knowing that survival was not just about living. It was about understanding, connection, and the remarkable power of human resilience.